Rarely have divisions among the transatlantic partners been on more open display than at this year's NATO summit in Brussels. It got off to a tense start with U.S. President Donald Trump insisting his NATO partners in general and Germany in particular must pay a larger share of the alliance's costs now. Is the U.S. president, who will go on to Moscow early next week, prepared to turn his back on NATO while embracing Russia? And could his tough talk and unpredictable actions undermine not only the transatlantic partnership, but the post-war order overall? How united is NATO? That's our topic this week on Quadriga, and these are our guests. It's a pleasure to welcome Claudia Meyer. She is Senior Associate for International Security at Germany's Institute for International and Security Affairs, and she says NATO is only as strong as its members make it. Open conflict undermines its collective defense commitment. And it's great to have with us on the show Christian Trippe. He's a security expert here at Deutsche Welle, and he says U.S. President Trump could sell out the alliance to Putin. This concrete fear among allies shows that NATO is eroding. And finally, we're very pleased to have with us Tyson. He's a foreign policy expert for the Aspen Institute here in Berlin, and he's a former State Department official. He says NATO focused for too long on threats from the East and the South and failed to take seriously the threat from within. So let me start out by asking you, Claudia Meyer, you wrote just before the summit that Europe's security is at stake, thereby mirroring Europeans' fear that the long-standing U.S. security guarantees for Europe are perhaps fraying. But despite Trump's aggressive rhetoric, he did sign the joint statement by the NATO members. So would you say the worrying here in Europe was perhaps a little bit unnecessary?
I think in the end, this summit is better than we thought. It's not yet over because I think we have to wait for the meeting with President Putin. And then we can probably do a kind of conclusion what really happened. But overall, I think the problem goes beyond the NATO summit. We have a major change in the transatlantic relationship between the US and the Europeans. And this is something that should worry us. If we are not united in NATO, in the transatlantic relationship, if there are doubts of us being together based on solidarity, then we are actually weaker, and that also applies to our security.
Christian Trippe, your opening statement says that NATO is eroding. But despite Trump's attacks, the alliance still does have very strong support in Washington. The Senate, for example, sent President Trump off on his trip with a resolution with a strong majority saying that the Senate absolutely supports NATO.
That's right, and perhaps we simply have a Donald Trump problem within NATO. If you look back at NATO's history, you see that in the 90s or in the 60s and 70s, there was often a public debate on where NATO should go to, how NATO should develop, what strategic outreach NATO should take. So it's not new for NATO to discuss where to go, to discuss its future, but what is new is the way, the style the American president throws into NATO, and this combined with his possible collusion with Russia, combined with this outlook on the summit with Mr. Putin, of course, creates serious worries. But coming back to your question, it's not NATO being in danger to be dissolved. The US in general is still supporting it, but we have a problem with the US president, for sure.
Tyson, your opening statement seems to imply that you think the problem goes beyond the U.S. president alone. You referred to the threat from within. What do you mean exactly by that?
Yeah, I mean, President Trump is just a symptom of something that is not just happening in the United States, but across the NATO space, which is an erosion of trust in democratic institutions, an erosion of trust in democracy itself, a return to kind of ethno-nationalism, isolationism, America first, Poland first, Hungary first, this firstism. And this is not circumscribed to one man or one country. This is across the board. And those are not the NATO values that were established after the Second World War.
Let me get us to all take a listen to a soundbite from President Trump at a rally that he attended last week, in other words, before leaving for the summit. And it essentially is Mr. Trump describing a batch of letters that he sent out to the other NATO members, and especially one letter in particular, namely to Chancellor Merkel.
You know, Angela, I can't guarantee it, but we're protecting you, and it means a lot more to you than protecting us, because I don't know how much protection we get by protecting you. And then they go out and they make a gas deal, oil and gas from Russia, where they pay billions and billions of dollars to Russia, okay? So they want to protect against Russia, yet they pay billions of dollars to Russia, and we're the schmucks that are paying for the whole thing.
The schmucks that pay for the whole thing. Let's deconstruct that statement that we heard there from President Trump, a number of aspects of which he did repeat as the NATO summit got underway. And let's begin with his final assertion that the U.S. bears a disproportionate share of NATO's costs. He put it a little more bluntly. The U.S., Claudia Meyer, does cover 67% of the NATO budget, with a contribution that amounts to over 3.5% of the U.S. GDP, its gross domestic product. Germany manages a paltry 1.2% of its GDP. The NATO allies claim they've gotten the message. Germany says it's going to go up to 1.5% by 2024. Is that good enough?
I think first one needs to be clear that the 3 something that the US spends on defence does not go entirely to NATO. So European security defence is a tiny element of the overall US defence budget. And the US is not in NATO because they find NATO that wonderful, but because it's part of their national interest. So I think we should be very clear about that. Having said that, there is indeed an issue of burden sharing. And the question of burden sharing is as old as NATO is. Every American president actually talked about burden sharing and called Europeans to do more for their defense. Rightly so. The Europeans have for a very long time they didn't pay enough attention to their own defence forces, to their own defence systems. So he is right in claiming more European commitment for defence. Germany has actually stepped up its commitment. Since 2014, the defence budget is growing. So we had some 32 billion in 2014. We are now 38-something billion in 2018, and it's going to grow. The problem is that the long-term development so far is not really in the plans. So we have a very strong political, rhetorical commitment by the Chancellor and by the Minister of Defence. But if you look in the financial planning of the German budget, it's not yet there. But what I really want to underline is that the debate about defence in Germany and in Europe has changed, and it has changed before Trump. It has changed since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and entered into war in eastern Ukraine. This was really a game changer for European security. It forced Europeans to relearn collective defence, because we concentrated upon crisis management like in Afghanistan or Libya. It forced Europeans to relearn collective defence with everything that it implies: logistics, capabilities, training, finances, everything. There is movement. It's not yet enough, but there's clearly movement.
Christian Trippe, many people watching from abroad would say the debate may have changed in Germany, but it's not changing fast enough. Germany's role in 2 world wars and in the Holocaust is often cited as a reason for a widespread public reluctance to see Germany take a stronger role militarily. But the fact is that history is receding ever further into the past. Isn't it high time that Germany does, in fact, do more?
Well, Germany started to do more, as Claudia just pointed out. I would like to say that this 2% target, spending 2% of the GDP for defense, is much older than Mr. Trump's term in office. It's a self-commitment from 2014, but it has been endorsed already 10 or 11 years ago for the first time, and ever since, not much happened in Europe. It's not only Germany who's lacking behind to meet that target. Many other countries, large countries, also are not there already. But coming back to Germany, yes, you're right. German history and the experience German society has made with the Second World War makes it difficult to talk about spending a lot for defense, about the military in general. The military has not very high esteem in German society anymore. But if this is, so to say, the long-term perspective, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism, it was Germany, it were the Germans who really were eager to consume the peace dividend, and that's what we did. And now, turning around is a very difficult process, apart from the long-term perspective of history.
Just briefly, do you think we see enough leadership from German politicians on this?
2 or 3 years ago, my answer had been no. I think it has started now, yes.
Tyson Barker, I know that you were working in the Obama-era White House. In other words, in the State Department. In other words, you were in the State Department at the time that, in 2014, the NATO members did sign up to this 2% commitment. President Trump is now talking about doubling that commitment to 4%. So my question to you, also as a former diplomat, how binding are these targets, and to what degree do they truly reflect the NATO members' actual contributions? Because if I look at it, Germany has sent a large number of forces to Afghanistan. I think it's the second largest provider of troops in Afghanistan. It has led a battalion in eastern Ukraine. So does this kind of target measurement in Eastern Europe, does this kind of target measurement really reflect the respective members' contributions?
Well, you know, it's just a target to focus the mind. I mean, it's easy to communicate. 2%, 2%. That's something you can say to your public. And now Trump, what he's doing is saying 4%. I don't think that this is something that he came up with on a whim, although it seems that way he's communicating it. But that's not meant for Germany. That's not meant for as a message to Merkel or anybody in Brussels. That's meant for as a message to his base back home. And what he's trying to do with his base, and this is what's worrying, this comes back to the threat from within, is basically create a part of the population of the United States that's hostile to NATO, that sees it as decadent, that sees it as a lot of countries that have enjoyed the American security blanket without paying in, without appreciating it sufficiently. And that's something he's creating a new resentment for. Right now in the United States, NATO has 62% approval. Actually, in Germany, it's 67%. But in the U.S., it's 62%. But where does that approval come from? 81% of liberals, Democrat-leaning voters support NATO, and only 49% of Republicans, and that's going down. So he's really creating a new skepticism for NATO within his base, and that's really worrying.
Just a little comment on this 2% target. NATO has been trying to find a better measurement for burden sharing, because only looking on cash is a bit easy. So we have in NATO another measurement, which are the so-called 3 Cs, which means cash, that's the budget, the money you put in, that's the 2%. Capabilities, so from tank to aircrafts, what you actually put in, and
Germany not looking too good on that measure at the moment.
Yes, but it's actually better than other states. And the third one is what we call contributions, so what a country actually gives from Afghanistan to the enhanced forward presence in the Baltic countries. And on the 2 other Cs, capabilities, so tanks and all that, and contributions, Germany is actually pretty good. So I think the focus on the 2% is actually that Trump has is not so much about 2%. It's actually about NATO as a multilateral alliance that he doesn't like. And this is the far bigger problem we have here, is that we have an American president who openly dislikes the transatlantic architecture as we used to have it before, with very strong ties in all policy areas, from trade to foreign policy to defense. And in all areas, he is questioning the very special transatlantic link. And that's something that should worry us, because that's for the future. It's actually very worrying that we might be growing apart between the US and Europe.
So how does Europe need to respond to that, Christian Trippe, either within NATO, the European NATO members, or outside of it? We have seen Europe taking moves now, 23 members of the EU, to strengthen their defense and security cooperation in an initiative known as PESCO. Is that actually a competitive threat to NATO, or is it a necessary and essentially long overdue move by Europe to get onto its own feet?
I think so. I can't interpret or read this as a threat to NATO. It's adding something special, adding a special value to NATO and NATO's efforts. And it's a sort, to my mind, it's a sort of contingency planning for the day, the unlikely day, the day we hopefully never see, when the US says, okay, we are no longer there. So Europe has to prepare, has to strengthen its own structures, its industrial bases to produce modern weaponry in order to meet scenarios like this. We are not there yet, so I don't want to sound alarmist to you, but Europe needs to shape its own defense future.
Tyson, the idea of the U.S. saying we're no longer there for you. If I come back to that soundbite we heard from Trump at that rally, and clearly it was intended for his base, but he says in that soundbite, essentially he implies that the U.S. doesn't get very much for the money that it puts into NATO. In other words, that old transactional idea of his. Would you agree with that? Do the gains, in fact, all flow to in one direction, namely to Europe?
Let me be diplomatic. He's wrong. The truth is that we have benefited for 70 years from NATO's presence, and NATO is a product of a failure to stay engaged in Europe after the First World War. That stability, that umbrella has created the space for the prosperity to develop in Europe. And we benefit so much, not just in the bilateral trade and investment relationship, but also in services. Our economy is become rich off of the investment of Europeans. And it's not just cars, it's things like use of digital platforms. The 5 biggest companies in the United States are all tech companies, have complete dominance in the European market. That is indirectly a product of NATO. The Europeans are prosperous. They're using these products. They're users. They all have iPhones. That is an indirect benefit from NATO. So, yes, we benefit enormously from NATO, and we need to keep that stability in the continent.
Claudia Meyer, in terms of the U.S. turning its back, Trump has made noises about pulling U.S. troops out of Europe and or especially out of Germany. Supposedly, he's asked the Pentagon to assess the cost and the impact of that. Do you think he really might make good on this threat?
It wouldn't make much sense to do so. We also have to understand that the roughly 38,000 U.S. soldiers in Germany are not there actually to protect Europe mainly, but they are forward base for US troops for many other crisis regions. So we have, for example, the US AFRICOM stationed in Germany. We have the US EUCOM in Germany. And Germany actually serves as a perfect, stable logistical hub to all crisis regions in the world. It's easier to go from Germany to the Middle East than to go from the US. One of the most modern US hospitals is in Germany. So actually the US benefits from the very stable European partner they have. The problem is that on rational terms, all that makes sense. But we don't know whether the president is going to decide based on rational terms. And that's actually the disruptive, unpredictable wildcard element he brings into European security.
Let's look at one other aspect of what we heard in that soundbite earlier, and let's do so in terms of a pattern that we've seen in other diplomatic settings as well. Whether it's NATO or the G7, Donald Trump's bravado often seems to be directed at a wider audience, voters at home, but also negotiating partners abroad. Many people are asking whether the president's latest tirades are, in fact, intended to impress the strongman he'll be meeting next week.
Trump and Putin. A deep understanding. Both love grand appearances. Both have narcissistic qualities. No wonder Trump can't stop raving about Putin.
I love Russia. I will say this, I'm meeting with President Putin next week, and getting along, let me tell you, getting along with Russia and getting along with China and getting along with other countries is a good thing.
And the Russian president was happy to charm Trump in return. Like here at the 2017 G20 summit in Hamburg.
I'm delighted to be able to meet you.
Trump hardly seems to mind that his administration is pushing ahead with investigations on Russian influence in the election that heaved him into office. Will Trump and Putin use their meeting in Helsinki to arrange secret deals and undermine NATO?
Tyson Barker, at the June G7 meeting, Trump rejected the final joint communique after already actually having signed it, saying essentially in a show of strength that was designed to impress Kim Jong-un, whom he was then traveling on to meet. Would you say the tirades we've been hearing from President Trump here are actually largely directed at impressing Vladimir Putin, and will they do so?
I think that's part of it, but he clearly has an affinity for Putin, and he has an affinity for Russia going back to the 1980s. You know, he's looking to come out of this meeting with some kind of optical deal, if not a real deal. You know, we'll see. But the truth is this administration has upped sanctions on Russia. It has delivered lethal assistance to Ukraine. So on the actual substance, there is a much more hawkish position vis-a-vis Russia than before, although the rhetoric is not reflecting that.
And Christian Trippe, you said in your opening statement that Trump could sell out the alliance to Putin. But if we look at the communique that he did sign here at the NATO summit, it is harshly critical of Russia. So how far could he actually go at this meeting?
What worries me a lot is that Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump will meet only with their translators, no note-takers, no political advisors soever. So this is the atmosphere, it's a sauna atmosphere where political deals are made. And if you look at the map of Europe and if you reflect at what's at stake, it's possible that Mr. Trump buys Putin's narrative that Crimea is not a Ukrainian peninsula annexed by Russia, but that it belongs to Russia, which would result in perhaps the immediate lift of US sanctions against Russia, just to give one example. And I'm afraid that a deal like that, a secret deal like that, might emerge from that meeting.
Tyson Barker, briefly, would the U.S. Congress go along with that?
Actually, Congress has locked into place these sanctions, so it would require congressional approval to remove them.
Claudia Meyer, NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says that he actually sees the Trump-Putin meeting as an opportunity. Is he just putting a good face on it, would you say? Or is it possible something positive could come of this?
I think it's partly putting a good face on. That's his job as NATO Secretary General. But I actually do think that there is a positive element if the leaders of those two big powers actually talk to each other. It's always a chance to solve something. We have so many crises from Ukraine to Syria, via nuclear weapons, so it's good to talk. The problem I see is that Putin is a very experienced head of state and a very good diplomat. So the fear I have is that Trump might make concessions above the heads of the European NATO allies, but that very much concern European security issues. That could be symbolic. For example, he could say, oh, maybe US troops don't participate in the next NATO exercise. But already the kind of political disunity or the political doubt whether the US is still with its European allies in NATO is already a major problem. NATO is a political alliance. States actually promise each other to stand up for each other in case of a crisis. And if there is the smallest, the tiniest doubt whether they really stick together, that has already implications for NATO's deterrence and defense. So better stay together and don't give any message of disunity.
Let me come back now at the end to the title of our program, which is Friendly Fire, How United is NATO, and come back to also to what Tyson Barker said to us at the outset when he talked about the threat from within, namely the undermining of democracy by the alliance's own members, which, of course, you could argue is very much in the interests of Russia. Christian Trippe, how can the alliance defeat that form of friendly fire?
Inside attacks, to be quite honest, if you look at Trump's behavior. Well, NATO has to take its own decisions serious and has to stick to the self-commitments, and it has to strengthen the European pillar of NATO, then it can survive.
You need to have an informed public. We need to invest more in our people, more faith in institutions. That's happening in the United States with Me Too, with the anti-gun movement, more grassroots engagement in politics. And we need to make the case for NATO to our people. We need to get out of the capitals.
Claudia Meyer, what would you say are the three most important things the alliance needs to do to underpin that crucial political foundation?
I think the first one is keep the Americans in, and the second is make Europe strong. So actually strengthen European defence, that means in terms of capabilities, in terms of finances. And what you mentioned, we need to talk about defence. We have to explain why it's worth defending the European project and the transatlantic relationship.
By doing what?
I think that's what I thought. It's financing, but it's also increasing the understanding of why defence actually matters. In the end, defence is about defending our way of life, our way of doing things. It's about our values. That can be done in a political way, but in the end, we must have also the military means ready. But we need to explain why the system we live in is actually worth to be defended.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.